Tabletops will start after the following messages.
Are you looking for something comfortable to wear and keep your brain warm while playing tabletop games? Daily Dose of Yarn makes handmade, customized beanies for all of your style and comfort needs. She can even help you with a custom beanie to represent your favorite character. Check out Daily Dose of Yarn on Instagram and Etsy to order your new favorite beanie today.
Welcome back, everyone, to Tabletop. As always, I'm your host, Nick Perrin, and today we are going a little bit off the beaten path to talk about music in TTRPGs. Today we are talking to Max Coltrin of Coltrin Compositions to talk about composing music for use in TTRPGs, how music can be used to heighten the game experience, and a lot more. Max, welcome to Tabletop.
Thanks, Nick. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, can you tell folks a little bit about yourself and how you kind of got into TTRPGs?
Yeah, TTRPGs as a whole, I had a friend who was, several years ago trying to get myself and some friends into it for a while, and then we finally kind of gave in, ended up playing with him, and, he was using music for or from films like Lord of the Rings, and games like Skyrim and stuff like that, but he was having... we were all, it was kind of taking away from the immersion because we were expecting things to kind of, be like Skyrim or be like Lord of the Rings because that's what we were listening to while we were playing. And it kind of, took us out because it was so recognizable. So, I've got a background in music. I was raised by a musical mother and spent a lot of years in choir, ended up doing some EDM production, was in a rock band, just kind of over the years. And so my DM, he was like, hey, I'm kind of sick of using all this recognizable stuff. Can you make me something original? And I was like, well, at that point, I'd never made anything orchestral or even close to it. And I was like, I can give it a try. So ended up making a small album for our campaign and uploaded it to Spotify just so that it was easy for us to access and he could put the music, into playlists that he was using. And it ended up kind of taking off a little bit and people were interested in it. And I've just kind of been making music for tabletop games ever since.
Yeah, and not only tabletop games, you've also worked on like short films, podcasts, video games. Can you tell me a little bit about how you approach sort of developing for these mediums? Are TTRPGs harder because of the interactive kind of element, or is it very similar to a video game in which you're kind of looking for a genre and then you're kind of going along those lines?
Yeah, so from a creative standpoint, it's definitely very similar. In a film you're supporting, or a film and video games, you're supporting something visual that's going on. Whereas with tabletop games, it's all kind of imaginary. We're all kind of trying to think it up. So there's definitely a bit of a challenge there in that the music is kind of the sole source of what you're trying to use to support, whatever emotion the game master is trying to portray. Now, from a technical standpoint, I would say it's actually far, far easier than something like film or video games. With video games, you have to make it loopable. So it's got to be seamless, and you kind of have to chop up the music in a certain way that makes it so that way you can program it into the game and make it, flow seamlessly. And then with film, you've got to make the music time perfectly with the things that are happening on screen. Whereas with tabletop music, it's just, you can make your music however you want to. Specifically for me, I try to make it pretty unobtrusive. So even if it's like loud and bombastic, like for a battle track, it's very much kind of a steady dynamic. Whereas something with a film or a video game, you've got lots of ups and downs and you've got to piece that all together. But yeah, like I mentioned, from a creative standpoint, very, very similar. You're still kind of doing similar composition techniques to support those emotions that you're trying to portray.
Yeah, and you have several albums out on Spotify right now for people to kind of check out and use in your games, or their games, I should say. How do you go about going through creating an album? Is it sort of one idea that you kind of come up with and decide to write an entire albums worth of tracks for? Or are you sort of thinking, okay, these are all the elements that I know might come up in a TTRPG game, and so I'm going to try to direct some of my tracks to accommodate for that sort of happening in a campaign?
Yeah, so my process has kind of evolved over time. I think I just released my 11th album, and each album that I've done has kind of been done in a different way. So for my first few albums, I actually was making music and sound effects specifically for my table, so whether it was for the tables that I was playing at or the tables that I was GMing for, it was kind of focused on, okay, I've got this scenario that I'm planning on running, or the DM has this scenario that they're planning on running. I'm going to make a track that fits that specific situation. And then from there, I kind of just started theming tracks based off of specific, themes, right? And so starting with, I want to say it was Fear the Eldritch. That was an album.
Which is great, by the way. I took a listen through some of them, and I really love that album specifically.
Thank you. It's definitely my most popular one. That one was, I released it specifically for a Halloween release because a lot of tables, a lot of tables like doing Halloween one-shots, depending on whatever system you want to use. And so I made an entire album kind of focused for those Halloween one-shots. But I do have a lot of experience kind of with Lovecraftian stuff as like reading and, just other forms of media. I'm really into that kind of stuff. And so it was pretty easy to make that album for me, honestly. I think I made that whole album in like 3 weeks, which was pretty incredible.
That's amazing.
But, and then from there, it was just kind of depending on what my patrons on Patreon would vote for a theme, or if I was just getting a lot of requests for a certain thing. One of my albums was even entirely a commission for a client who had built his own homebrew world and came to me and was like, hey, I've got this homebrew world and I want to make, I want to track for each of the individual races that are in my world. So that album ended up being Illyria. And each of those tracks, were kind of like, one is for the elves in his world, another one is for the dwarves, and so on and so forth. And so it really, depending on the album, it kind of depends on what else is going on, both, me personally on a commission basis, and then also what's going on at that time of year, including what's going on with specific tabletop games at that point in time.
Yeah, it's so interesting too, because music is such a hard line right into our emotions. And I think that it is sort of underused in TTRPGs, especially even the people who do use it. Like I have used sort of like soundtrack inspirations in my campaign by like playing certain things from like a Wes Anderson film, or like Trent Reznor's sort of atmospheric stuff that he does for soundtracks nowadays. Can you talk a little bit about how your philosophy when it comes to like how music can be used in TTRPGs? You mentioned that you're a GM. For me, when I'm at a table, a lot of times I have like 100 things going on in my head, and it's hard for me to like cue up something and play it at just the right moment. As somebody who creates for the medium, how do you suggest people sort of dip their toe into using music at their table? How do you suggest people really start bringing in this entire element of kind of theater, I guess, into a home game so that they can really wow their players and just add this new fun element of atmosphere to their games?
Yeah, so honestly, something I've noticed is that it really depends on the GM. So for instance, you've got the GMs who are going for ultimate immersion, and, everybody at the table is role playing the whole time, and it's all about the story. And so in that case, you're going to get a lot of, in the case of like fantasy games like D&D, you're going to get a lot of orchestral stuff, which, you can get from soundtracks and other things. And that definitely tends to be the most commonplace. And I think that's probably the smartest place to start is, start off with media that you're familiar with and look at movies and video games and, think about how you feel during a certain moment where a song is played, and then try incorporating that into your game and see how it works. At the same time, there's a lot of tables who still listen to music while they play, but it's not so much about the immersion aspect as much as, instilling a certain emotion that might be separate from immersion, or even just music just to kind of relax and just hang out to and just have something going on in the background. So for instance, one of the tables I play
music
at,
to eat pizza to.
Exactly. So like at one of the tables I play at, the GM for like battle music, he straight up just does like modern metal, like bands like Disturbed. And that's kind of our battle music. And so it's a very different experience than the other table that I play at, where it is more, immersive based. And so I think if you are a GM and you're, wondering, how to incorporate music, the best way is just to kind of pick something and roll with it. See how it works for you, see how it works for your players, and just kind of make adjustments based on that.
So when you say just pick something and roll with it, do you have like sort of a direction that you would start with someone who is very hesitant or maybe doesn't feel like they're very musically savvy to get them started on this road? Do you have like, just grab a soundtrack of a movie that you like, or like classical music, or like you said, like Disturbed metal and all that kind of stuff, like even stuff with lyrics in the background? Do you have sort of a place for GMs to start if they're a little cautious about wanting to dip their toes into this area of gaming?
Yeah, I think for sure, a really good place to start is just the media that you're familiar with, because then that way it's, you're not necessarily looking for brand new stuff that you've never listened to, and then you have to listen to hours and hours of all this stuff that you're not familiar with, right? At the same time, the world of tabletop composers is actually pretty large. There's a lot of us at this point. And so if you are, looking for specific composers who make music specifically for this medium, there are a lot of us out there. And I think that a lot of us, we are active on social media, we're all on Spotify and Apple Music and everywhere else you can find us. And if you just do simple searches such as, like fantasy music, right? That's going to lead you down a path that's going to open up a whole world of music that you can spend, hours and hours filtering through. There's also, definitely music for RPG is a subreddit that's on Reddit. And that's a really, really solid source for finding different tracks that people share that they either use in their table. And a lot of the sub is actually just composers like myself sharing our music that we make for tabletop games. So I think if you are, kind of starting from square one, and you have no idea where to start with music, start with the media that you're familiar with. And if that's just not working for you, then time to start, delving a little bit deeper into Reddit, into just Google, YouTube, and just give stuff a listen, kind of skip around tracks so you don't have to spend so much time. You can listen for 10 seconds at the beginning, then skip 30 seconds. Let's listen to 10 seconds of that. And just, it's kind of a good way to kind of filter through things a little bit easier. And at the same time, if you are somebody who uses Spotify or YouTube or Apple Music, there are a lot of people who already make playlists for specific situations. I know that a name I like to throw around a lot is Will Savino. He's a kind of a big name in this field, and he's got several playlists on Spotify that are, have thousands of likes on them. And, some of them are like D&D Calm or D&D Battle, D&D Boss. And so finding specific playlists that other people have curated could also be a really good place to start.
That's a really good point. Like, the resources, like, people have already done this work. There's a lot of it out there already that you can just sort of grab and try out. One thing that I'm really interested to hear from you, you mentioned that you GM as well. Do you use music in your games? And if so, like, what is your approach to it?
Yeah, I definitely do use music in my games. And it depends on kind of what I'm GMing for. So I've done some mini campaigns, right? And I'm actually in the process of building a full campaign right now. And I've done a lot of one-shots. So for things such as one-shots, my process for picking music might be very different. So if it's a Halloween one-shot, I might be going less for immersion and a lot more for scare factor. So something with, some good jump scares where I can just press a button and then boom, there's something that just shocks all of the players that they weren't expecting. And now they're all on their toes and, definitely takes away from the immersion, but adds a lot to just the fun of the one shot. Whereas if it is like a mini campaign or a full campaign, then, it can depend there too. Most of the time it is going to be for supporting that emotion, right? And so if they're, traveling through If it's like a traveling montage scene, right, that's going to be something that's maybe a little bit less immersive. Whereas if it's something like a big baddie's monologue right before they enter battle, that's going to be something that's going to be a lot more immersive to kind of express how that particular character is feeling more so than maybe supporting the environment that they're in, I guess. So there's a lot of ways to kind of go at it. And, for me, because I am a composer and I make music, it's I definitely think that I come at it from a bit of a wider perspective than most GMs might.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that just the fact that you can like queue up certain moments with music is just, I want to get there so badly in my games. It's something that I've been playing around with ever since we started talking too. And before, I would only do it during prologues and epilogues. I would throw on some music while I narrated, essentially, so that they could kind of be feeling a little bit more immersed. But I did try out doing some atmospheric stuff for a little spooky one shot that I did a couple weeks back, and it was super effective. I really loved it, but also I had there was like a Haunting of Hill House song in there in this playlist, and it just all of a sudden had somebody screaming in the middle of it. So like every half hour or 45 minutes or so, there would just be this like horrible scream, and everyone would be like, Jesus Christ, like turn that off.
Which definitely, like, again, coming to GM style, right? Like for some tables that might work really well having that random scream, whereas for other tables they might be like, oh, that's, I don't want that kind of stuff, jolting me out of it. So, looping back around very much depends on the GM, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I want to talk a little bit about is sort of the fundamentals of music when you are creating. If somebody is interested in creating some of their own really basic stuff that they're doing for a specific moment that they have in their campaign that's like very, specific to their campaign, do you have any like advice for them, like certain, a minor scale makes people feel like this kind of thing? Is there any sort of like TTRPG composing rules that you like to follow?
I think if you're starting out, from the bare bone basics, doing something melodic or even harmonic might be a bit of an advanced step if you're not super familiar with music. Now, something that a lot of us do, there's a lot of tabletop composers who know absolutely nothing about music theory, and it's very, very possible to be successful with that. So, there's a lot of like soundscapey kind of stuff, right? So you can kind of go for more sound effects that are kind of drawn out and kind of create that ambience, and it's a lot more of what we call atonal, right? So there's no key. There's no musical key, and it's just kind of sounds that just kind of float in and out. Now, kind of jumping off of that, there's actually a small product that I'm actually in the middle of working on that will allow people to do exactly that. And it's what I'm planning on doing is kind of doing a loop-based system. So basically, you can choose from several loops that are going to be keyed by emotion, and then you can stack those on top of each other to create different, emotions that you're kind of trying to portray. So for instance, you could take one loop, which would be, a 2-minute track of a single instrument that might be labeled scary. And then you could layer that on top of another loop that's also 2 minutes that might be labeled hopeful, right? And so now you're mixing this scary kind of instrument with this hopeful kind of instrument to kind of create this new thing. And so that's something that I've actually been working with a lot of Discords on and some other influencers and stuff, and I've been getting feedback. So hopefully that'll be coming out pretty soon, and that should make this kind of process a lot easier for GMs or even just people in general who want to get started in this.
Man, that sounds amazing, just because that sort of kind of looping technology, like in GarageBand or whatever, has been around for a long time, and it's so much fun to play with. And I think that a lot of GMs are really going to love diving into like structuring these loops and this these emotional sounds that they can kind of pile on top of each other and stretch out to really make customizable moments. I think that's going to be really, really cool.
I hope so.
Yeah. And that's the thing that I'm also really interested about your work. When I listen through some of the tracks, a lot of them feel fairly specific too. Like they I found a lot of them, which I'm like, wow, this would be great for this moment, or this would be great for this type of thing. How do you make music for campaigns that you really have no insight into? So like, do you ever, I guess what I'm asking is like, how do you know the moments that are going to come up in a campaign? Because I found some and I was like, this is wild that this is so perfect for this thing that I'm about to do, or whatever it was. So
So that, I think, that definitely comes down to how the composer kind of goes about it, right? So I guess, kind of coming back to these playlists with like D&D Calm, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of GMs who would rather just put on a playlist called D&D Calm, and it's just filled with, kind of orchestral fantasy themed music that isn't super thematic, no super strong melodies that maybe are, super specific. And so there's definitely, a bunch of music that I make that is a bit more like that, where it's, I guess a little bit less involved is kind of a good way to put that, and a bit more generic. And then there are, a good chunk of things where, a lot of the tracks that I've made have been commissions for a specific scenario, in which case, it's a little bit, there's a lot more direction in kind of how that track is being made. So for myself personally, I definitely have a big variety of, making music that can kind of just be used by the general public for the most part, and then those things for those super specific moments. And I think that as far as tabletop composers go, I'm a little bit unique in that regard, in that I do make tracks that are for very specific kind of moments. Yeah. Because for most composers, that's not very lucrative if you're only making tracks that can only be used, once every month by a table, versus those D&D Calm tracks that you can just loop every single session that every table can use.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to get a little bit more into that right after these messages.
Hey, I'm Brando.
And I'm Owen.
And we're the hosts of Banter and Such.
Each week we get together with the most interesting people that we know and talk about the things that we're generally interested in.
Like movies.
TV shows.
Movies.
Nostalgic childhood franchises.
Movies.
Urban legends.
And sometimes movies.
So check out Banter and Such anywhere you get podcasts.
Banter, ampersand, such.
Or banter and then the word and then such.
Or just banter and it fills in the rest automatically for you and you just click on it.
Either way, it's called Banter and Such.
Want to get into some BS with us?
All right, we are back talking about music and TTRPGs with Max Coltrin of Coltrin Compositions. So before the break, we were talking a little bit about different ways that people can incorporate it and how you compose. Can you tell us a little bit about how music kind of affects our storytelling? Because a lot of times, I mean, the classic example is if you go into a haunted house and you have like, earbuds in or something and you walk through, it's like very much okay. And then, or at least for me, and then you take them out and you're like, this is the most terrifying thing ever. So do you have a little bit of insight? I know that as I was doing research on you, that you have gone to Berkeley, you have this huge compositional background. Do you have any theory for us to kind of talk a little bit about why music kind of does that to us when we are interfacing with it in media?
Yeah, so I think it's actually talked about quite a lot, how, especially in film, if you watch a film and it has no music, it's just sound effects and dialogue and what's happening on screen, it feels very, very empty, right? And I think a big part of that is because, as humans, we have all these senses, right? And we use them all at once to kind of tell us, how we should be feeling, how we should be reacting to our environment. So for instance, if we're going way back in, prehistoric times, when we're listening, it's a lot more for survival, right? Yeah. And I think that very much still plays a part in today where, kind of going back to the haunted house analogy there, where it's, if you're hearing that intense music, that kind of mimics the sounds of danger that we might have heard in prehistoric times, whether it is, kind of matching the sounds of screaming creatures or crying children or whatever. And that's something that I think a lot of composers do take into consideration when they're making music is, okay, if we're in a strictly natural environment with no music, what might we be hearing in this kind of environment? Right. So in the case of something like tabletop RPGs, the music that you use will very much affect how your narration is perceived by your players. So, kind of coming back to the haunted house, let's say, rather than no music, let's say rather than scary music, let's say, you're playing something that's kind of a bombastic, epic orchestral music as you're walking through this haunted house.
Yeah.
Now it's not so much that it's scary as much as I feel like I need to fight these things that are chasing after me, And so it's when you're looking at energy levels, especially, you can look at genres, of course, but energy levels, I think very, very much are probably the most important part of how you decide what music to play in your sessions. Is this a high energy moment? Is this a low energy moment? And then that's going to kind of support how you want your scene to be perceived. And then you can kind of branch into genre depending on what kind of GM you are and what kind of setting you're using. Is it a sci-fi game that you're playing? Okay, then maybe something a bit more cyberpunky may work, but something orchestral and fantasy themed very well could work. And vice versa, you can use something that's a bit more cyberpunky to kind of express, in a fantasy setting, maybe something more eldritch, So there's a lot of variability in how you can go about that.
One thing that kind of came up for me while you were talking about that is, have you seen or experienced a GM being able to sort of manipulate the outcome of a part of the campaign by using music in a very specific way? Like you said with the haunted house bombastic music example, is there a way to get a group to, instead of, being super afraid of this challenge that you are setting up for them, by kind of influencing them by adding a certain type of music so that they kind of either subconsciously or consciously cue into, storytelling tropes tell me that this music with this situation means I should do something like this. Have you seen that ever play out at a table?
Yes, I think a great example of this is carnivals or fairs in a tabletop setting, right? So I think it's pretty popular, for GMs to have some kind of situation where their players come across a carnival or a fair or what have you. And, there's a bunch of games for the players to play where they can roll dice and just kind of relax or have fun or whatever. But, there's definitely scary carnivals. That's very much a stereotype you can play into. And then there's very much, these super goofy, lighthearted kind of carnivals. So something that is a lot of fun to do for me when I'm doing a carnival is kind of that transition from that happy-go-lucky, everything's comedic, and then maybe they reach a game where they come to this realization that, maybe this carnival isn't what it seems, maybe this is something much darker, and then you can kind of use the music to kind of transition into that darker phase of them discovering the truth about this carnival.
Yeah, even, my brain is on fire because I'm like, oh man, it would be amazing to have a track that is like 30 minutes long, and then halfway through it slowly starts fading into a different track altogether. That is just like super the opposite either genre or feeling that it started with, so that you can sort of track a emotional change within the group without even having to play on the computer to try to switch up music, to just say, this is set. I have a timer of 30 minutes to slowly guide them into this new feeling that they're about to find themselves in. That just sounds very exciting to me.
Yeah, for sure.
One thing that I was also really curious about your insights into is how to use silence in games. For me, I think that silence is like one of the more powerful emotional sounds, I guess, that you can use. For example, in Star Wars, when they were doing that light speed jump in the Star Destroyer or whatever, and it just like all the sound and all the audio cuts out, and so you're just seeing this pretty violent, vicious starship kind of exploding essentially, and it's completely silent. It had a real emotional resonance. And so I was kind of interested in your thoughts on silence and how GMs can use it effectively in their games.
Yeah, I think, if you are a GM who is using music for most of your session and you want to use a period of silence for kind of an impact, I think, anytime you want your players to really pay attention to what you're saying, that's the time to cut the music, right? When you want the players to be, or when you want your players to feel a little bit ambiguous, like, okay, how are we supposed to feel here? Silence is a great way to kind of keep your players on their toes and kind of make them feel a little expectant because they know that music is going to be coming up in a second. But during this moment of silence, what is it? What's about to happen? And I think that another great example of this is horror films, right? So, you've got your music throughout the film, but then you just cut all of the music when something's about to happen. The main character's walking down the hall and they're about to open up a door and it's super silent. And then they open up the door and either, it's something that's not scary at all on the other side, or it's something that's super scary. And then either way, we were tense in that moment. We were tense during that silence. And so that resolution of that tension, whether it was something scary or something lighthearted, it kind of, either way, it relieves that tension and kind of brings us more into the story.
Yeah, it totally makes sense to me that when you take out the audio out of something, that all of your other senses sort of like lean in to make up for that lack of information that it is no longer getting.
Exactly.
And I think that makes a lot of sense to use it. I would like to really punctuate big moments, like if there's a character death, you cut that bombastic music and then you slowly start to narrate, this character, like his final moments or something. And everyone is going to lean in for that and to really pay attention because, that is what the focus is on. You're changing the focus from the atmosphere and what's happening and everyone rolling dice. You're cutting basically all of that out all of a sudden and saying like, everyone listen to what I'm about to say.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think that's really interesting too, how GMs are kind of asked to do a lot. It's sort of like you are the MC of a cabaret sometimes, where you're doing all the funny voices and you're queuing up music and you're putting out minis and you have the maps and you're trying to engage everyone. For people who are feeling a little bit kind of overwhelmed by all of this, and you said before, like, it's okay, just throw on just general hangout music, because that can help. Can you speak a little bit to what you would do in those cases and like what you're trying to evoke out of it so that they can, put on that hangout music, but then really still use it effectively?
Yeah. So, something that kind of as an example that I've been seeing a bit of a rise in is, definitely like those players that, or those tables that want just that hangout music, but there's plenty of themed background music that you can do that will still kind of set the scene for the game that you're playing. Right. So, for instance, a genre that I'm kind of breaking into a little bit is fantasy lo-fi. So you've got that kind of lo-fi aspect that definitely kind of says, okay, we're here, we're all we're all in this, kitchen or whatever you are playing, and we're all just having a good time. But we've got these fantasy flutes or violins or whatever that are going over it that kind of get us in the mindset of the genre. And so I think that if you are kind of looking to do that, it's really good to just kind of branch into that, the more modern music and that more thematic stuff. A really good example of this is Celestial Eon Project. He's a pretty popular one, and he used to actually market his stuff as being for tabletop games before he finally kind of just went, screw it. I'm just making, music just to kind of make you all happy. And so that's a really good artist that kind of does that. But I think, no matter how you're using music in your games, if you're not wanting to use stuff that you're familiar with, it's definitely going to take some digging. It's definitely going to take some research, some searching on Spotify or YouTube or what have you. But I think that if you are just kind of looking for general hangout music, it's definitely a lot easier to come across and to compile than it is for, planning out these specific situations and scenarios.
Yeah, and I know that we talked about it a little bit before about sort of your guidance to say like, okay, jump into the music, listen for 10 seconds, kind of keep going in. But what are your favorite methods of essentially finding the music that speaks to you and stuff that you want to start bringing into your campaign or game? Is there a way that you would suggest people start kind of culling through the vast amounts of music out there to start finding that specific stuff that they're into?
Yeah. So for me, I make it, right? Yeah. Like I use the music that I make. And so for me, it's pretty easy.
Get Logic Pro on your computer, start learning how to use it.
But yeah, no, I think, I think that, finding those playlists that other people have made is a really good starting point. And I think that a lot of it is, the people who make those playlists, it's not so much, listen to this playlist while you play, which you definitely can. But for a lot of these people who make these playlists, it's, here's all of the tracks that I use in my sessions, but I don't listen to this playlist, right? I use all of these tracks in a variety of playlists that I've created. And I think that that's a really good way for other people to kind of build out their own playlists, is go to these playlists, listen to them, bounce around the tracks, and then kind of think, oh, yeah, that track would work really well for this thing that I've got coming up. And this one would work well for this. And just kind of like picking out individual tracks from playlists as you're listening to it. And something that I even do, because I've been painting minis for a little bit now. And so I'll listen to these playlists. I've kind of gone off the deep end pretty recently with it. It's been a blast, but yeah, it's real fun for me, to just kind of listen to these playlists while I'm painting minis. And then if I hear a track that I think, would work well for something that I've got planned, then, I'll set down my mini for a second. I'll click and drag that track over to a playlist, and then I'll keep doing what I'm doing. And I think that there is kind of this fear for a lot of GMs that you have to be actively paying attention to the tracks that you're scouting for, to be able to put them in. But the truth is, like, just listen like you would listen to any other music while you're working, while you're driving, while you're doing whatever you're doing, and just kind of absorb yourself into this music so that you can kind of get a better feeling of, how is it going to work in a session? Like, for instance, while I'm sitting there painting minis, it's the music that I'm listening to it's going to affect me emotionally, right? It's music, no matter when we listen to music, it's going to affect us emotionally. So think about how it affects your day-to-day life when you're listening to this music. And I think that's a really good way, to not be super attentive, because your players, and even you, when you're playing, you're not going to be actively listening to the music. You're not going to be completely focused on it. It's kind of going to be in the background. And so a really good way to find those tracks is to just go about your daily life, let it be in the background, and see how it feels.
Yeah, I love that advice. I think that makes a lot of sense to me, that instead of always thinking you have to be an active listener to find, the perfect piece that is like, composed in a way that perfectly summarizes your campaign or a specific moment you're planning, instead having that sort of passive interaction with it, because that's how your players are going to have their interaction with it. They're going to be focused on the game. They're going to be focused on their character sheets and talking to each other. It's going to be in the background anyway. So it's best to look in that way so that while you're experiencing it, you can really get a sense of what is going to move you in a specific way, even when your attention isn't 100% on it.
Exactly.
This has been such a great talk, and I want to kind of shift a little bit to talk specifically about you and Coltrin compositions and all of your work. Can you tell us a little bit about, like you told us about the origins of you starting to do this kind of for your friends, and then putting it up and it becoming popular and continuing to do it? Can you talk a little bit about what you sort of offer people and what people can expect when they kind of search your name on the internet?
Yeah. So honestly, with my music in particular, there's a massive variety. I think that a lot of tabletop composers kind of focus on, either fantasy or they focus on sci-fi. And I think that's kind of like the big two, right? That's kind of going on right now.
It's like D&D or Warhammer.
Exactly. And so, for myself, I try to, every album, I try to have something for everybody, right? So, on each of my albums, I try to have something that's, a good battle track, something that's a good melancholy track, something more uplifting, something more calm. And then with each of those albums kind of being themed on a different thing, it kind of gives you a good idea of how you might be able to use those. So my most recent album is called Frozen Over. And it's, I think, a 7-track album, very, very short, but each of the tracks are completely different. So it opens up with some fantasy lo-fi, then you move into kind of like this piano lullaby, which then moves into something that's more melancholy, and then you end up moving to a soundscape that's just a fireplace with no music. You move into a battle track, so on and so forth. So I think if you are looking at my music specifically, don't listen to just 1 or 2 tracks and be like, oh, he doesn't have a style that I really care for. Because a lot of us, and especially myself, we try out a lot of different genres because we want everybody to use our music and have something for it. And so when you are looking at my music, looking at the album and kind of judging what that theme is will give you a good idea of what it might be useful for. But then if you do bounce around the tracks, even in there, you're going to see a bunch of variety.
So what is your preferred entry point for folks who are getting into your work? So do you have a specific place that you're like, this is what I want you to hear first, or this is what I'm really wanting people to see so that they can get like a sense of what I create, what I'm into? Or are you just like, start listening to anything, it's all really great, it's all stuff that I'm 100%, that is the entry point into my work and I'm fine with it? Or do you have a specific kind of vector you want people to enter into?
Yeah, I think, it's probably the best albums I've made for sure have been Illyria, Fear the Eldritch, and Roll Initiative. Mm-hmm. And I think, if you are kind of just jumping into my discography for the first time, that kind of comes down to, what you're looking for. So Illyria is definitely more kind of like a gothic fantasy album that works well for any setting, whether it is fantasy or horror or sci-fi or modern or something completely unrelated. That's an album that I really tried to focus on kind of being very open. And then Fear the Eldritch tends to be a much more ambient album. So anytime you need something creepy, you don't need to be playing Call of Cthulhu or fantasy or sci-fi. That's just, in general, a really good album to kind of explore the darker side of my music. And then Roll Initiative is just what it sounds like. It's all battle tracks.
Battle music.
So yeah, so
amazing.
Each of those tracks, I've got a couple on there that are, kind of more cyberpunky, kind of more made for sci-fi. I've got my fantasy stuff, and I even have a chiptune track in there that I kind of tried to model after like old, Super Nintendo JRPGs and,
Nice.
That style of combat. So I think if you are looking to just completely start completely fresh with my discography, any of those 3 albums you're going to find good stuff in there.
And that's not the only way people can kind of get into your music as well. You also have a Patreon and a website. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit about all the different things that you have on offer so we can make sure that all of these links are in the show notes so people can go check you out, but also what you have on offer in those places?
Yeah, so I'm on all music sites, pretty much everything. I don't think there's any site I can't think of that I'm not on. And then as far as the Patreon is concerned, that's something that I have been trying to push a bit more. I release all of my music to my patrons as soon as I finish it. So people on my Patreon, you might get access to a track months before the public does, because then you don't need to wait for a whole album to be finished and then for it to be released and all of that. So if you want to get my music before anybody else, joining the Patreon is definitely the best way to do that. And if you are a patron, in fact, just in general, everybody can use my music for free. I just ask for credit. There's no commercial license or anything, and so if you do join the Patreon, all of those early release tracks, you can also use for free. You can also use commercially as long as you credit me. And if you are, looking at the Patreon, we've got a $3 tier, which gets you all the MP3s, early access to everything, as well as full access to the library. The $5 tier gets you WAV files, so you get the high quality stuff. And then I've got a promotion going on for the normally $8 tier, which is now $6. And that gets you additional things that I work on with collaborators. So I collaborate with a lot of like map makers and, people who make homebrew items or monsters or encounters. And I release all of that to that tier. And I also make 1 hour loops of all of my music. So every track I have, there's a 1 hour looped version of it that's accessible to that tier, which has been pretty popular for a lot of people. And I think it's a really good way to, kind of set it and forget it for a lot of us. But other than that, Bandcamp is also a really good way to support me. We get all artists tend to get a pretty good cut from Bandcamp, and it's better than a lot of the other sites. But I think if you are, looking to specifically support me, Patreon and Bandcamp are probably the best ways to do that. And you do tend to get some exclusives and some early access on both of those sites.
Yeah, and honestly, it's really fantastic. I've, like I said, taken a look through your discography. I've looked at the Patreon and everything. And for people who are looking into, actual play work or developing some sort of fantasy themed product, things like that, this is a really great option. You have some really, really beautiful work. And like you said, being able to use it with credit and, of course, it's just like very, very nice. So that $5 tier, pretty solid for everyone who's listening. And I just wanted to say thank you so much, Max, for coming on Tabletop. Is there anything else, like where can people find you on socials and follow you in that way?
Yeah, so you can access all of my links from my link tree. So that's just linktr.ee/Coltrin Compositions. And that will get you access to everywhere that I am online, all of my socials, all of my music sites, all of it.
Amazing. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Once again, for everyone, Max Coltrin of Coltrin Compositions is a graduate of Berkeley who specializes in thematic music for TTRPGs and fictional worlds. Thank you so much, Max, for coming on Tabletop.
Thank you so much. It was great being here.